So it does kind of lead you to a discussion around communications, right? Because it's come up a couple of times, part of the discussion, and so one of the things we wanted to ask here was, do we communicate enough? Do we want what things would you want more of? What things would you want less of? What things would how do we communicate it? Does that work well? And are there ways that we're not communicating that we can use to engage better? Someone suggested if we had the bishop on the road every day and he went and visited parishioners everywhere in the diocese every single day, I'm not sure that's a practical method. Yeah, until we come up with a Star Trek teleporter, that's a tough one. But how do we drive more engagement? So first, let's go back. Do we communicate enough as a diocese? And I want to. This is as a diocese, as the people of the churches, do we communicate enough?
Philip
Should be on.
Philip Berry from All Saints, South Grenville. I think the diocese is beginning to make progress in that respect. Something as simple as a weekly newsletter is in fact a useful tool. The video conferencing link we're using right now is a useful tool. I think that probably those tools like that can be built upon. But it only occurred to me just as you were speaking, Alex, that perhaps the parishes could do a better job somehow, and I'm not coming up with an idea here, a better job of communicating both with the diocese and with each other. And this isn't a criticism, it just strikes me now that there is very effective communication, or growingly effective communication, in one direction, and maybe other directions could be made use of as well.
That is something that I think we have talked about before. And I think in the old days, it was kind of the old spoke and hub model. Everything flowed to the diocese and then flowed back out. So things went from, South Grenville came to the diocese and then they went to Lyndhurst or went to North Leeds. But now we're in a network world. We're in a world where you can wave your PC or your text and we can be talking to 25 people. So I think as we need to shift our model to say, how do we start to do that? I think part of that I've heard a couple of times is things like the vignettes that were done at Synod, which by the way are on the website. But if you notice, when we were changing sessions at Synod, there was some wonderful vignettes about some of the mission work that's going on, right? The work that's gone on at St. Luke's that Don Goodwin in particular talked about, the work that's gone on at St. Mary Mag's in Picton. Some of those, so there was pieces like that, the habitat stuff that gives you, it personalizes it. And because it has the people that are doing it tell the story. So I think there's, do we do more of that kind of stuff? Because that starts to come to where Trish talked earlier about how do I figure this out? And I was in a parish, Wayne and I, in June that is having some difficulties. One of the things they were asking is, what do others do? How do others approach this? What do you do to start to get this conversation started? The second thing I would just touch that is what we're trying to do is, as we now get this technology sorted, is also make it available out to parishes so that, we can say, yep, there'll be an account for this kind of thing for each parish, right? So each incumbent will have access to say, yep, we can have our own conference bridge, so to speak, so that each parish can start doing that work. And feeding through each of our organizations, our committees and working groups, and that they have access to it, so we can start pushing things through to be able to draw more connections. But the other observation I would make is you got to want to make those connections, right? It's fine to say that the plugs are hanging there, but we need to work out, because again, we tend to approach things oftentimes as, I look at what my parish does. I'm part of this church. I'm part of St. Swithin's in the Swamp. And, what are we doing from here? Any other reflections or input? Oh, Wayne, I guess Philip's got a follow-up.
Philip Berry again. It just occurred to me as you were speaking, Alex, that the format we're engaged in at this minute has some potential. I'm not suggesting that we need to very frequently take the elaborate trouble that's been taken to set this up, but something like it might very possibly be useful because this is a conversation not only between parish and diocese, but between parish and parish. And I think it has the potential to be very helpful.
And actually, it isn't that big a deal to set this up. I mean, literally, we did more work. I mean, Mark's got it set up in Trenton, but we did as much work setting the room up as we did setting the technology up. And I think if we all wanted to do this from home, right? And I understand there's value in face to face. There's value in shaking hands. There's value in standing at the coffee and getting one and the social and human elements. But there are also times when just the dialogue can happen just this way. And you can look at, I think Nancy and Nancy are both in their home locations. Mike, that doesn't look like St. Christ Church. I bet you are a Madoc. But you can be where you can connect from and then be part of the dialogue. The other connection, if Michael Reed was here, he'd be talking about the regional councils, because that was intended, again, to be a format where you can have these discussions. Diocese doesn't need to be involved in that. Our goal is to help facilitate it. But that discussion, and I would say this, that it's gotten off to a good start. Leeds, Grenville, there's some things happened there. There's been some things happen here in Frontenac. We've had a little more of a slower start in Hastings and Quinte, but part of that is to come together and talk to each other about the challenges, talk to each other about the good things, the harder things, what works, why it works, and share some of that. So I would also say the regional council piece. And let me ask the question: what's your thoughts on regional councils? Apart from the name, we've struggled. Everybody has baggage and history, no matter what you call something. But how many? I guess it's hard to do, but for those that can see, how many have been to one of those regional meetings? So we got a good number here. Nancy's got her hand up. Nancy McLeod, that is. So do we need?
And Nancy McLeod from Leeds Anglican Ministries would just jump in here to say, yes, I think those regional councils, or whatever form they take, are a very important thing. I think it's something that we've discovered, having recently just come together as Leeds Anglican Ministries. We have 4 contiguous parishes that are getting to know each other now through our relationship, and we have so many other parishes joining us that it would be really good to have more opportunity for interacting in that way. And I've just been reflecting on what Philip said about the communication, and there is excellent communication coming out of the diocese, not so much coming back from the parishes. And I know we have the facility on e-news to be having more of that as part of e-news. Maybe that's part of the regional process, that we need to have some kind of a regional bulletin boards or something like that set up so that that information can be exchanged more easily.
That something are their heads nodding? I mean, I kind of always look for reaction, but is that something that, because again, that the e-news is a vehicle. Mark does a great job with the pipeline, and Mark builds some content, but for this to be really valuable, I believe the content's got to come from everywhere, not just from a single point of.
Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, when I look at it, there are a few parishes that are very good at making sure that their events are on there. And I have to say, honestly, that we haven't been particularly good at that. But I'm just wondering if there was some sort of similar thing, either on a Facebook level or some other way of doing that within our regions, so that we can have some conversations there, have some communication there.
And certainly a variety of ways to try and do that, right? I mean, you can use Google Groups, you can use Facebook, you can use, chat rooms. There's a variety of ways to help facilitate that. I think generally the guideline I think should be keep the technological requirement as low as possible. Keep the user experience simple and rich, and keep the threshold, the barriers as low as one can.
Mark Hauser, St. Mary Magdalene, Napanee. Nancy, just following through with what you're saying, just from where I sit, and the things that do come to me as the communications person when I think too about the articles I receive for the Dialogue newspaper. And I think this is something, there's probably a law that governs this in nature, but you tend to sort of hear from the same people repeatedly. And I'm not sure why that is. When I do my parish newsletter, I don't know if anyone from St. Mary Magdalene is listening right now, but when I do the parish newsletter, what would happen is you kind of end up, you go down that road, and then you kind of end up in a place where you're just hear from the same four people, or you end up with the same four people writing for your newsletter. And it's a question of how, okay, well, that's great, but what about the ones who aren't engaging, who are not contributing? How do you get over that hump? It's like Facebook. There's actually it's called the Nielsen rule, which governs, if you look at Facebook, I think it's 20% of the participants contribute like 10% of the content. I can't remember the numbers, but a small percentage contribute 90% of the content in Facebook, whereas a huge portion are basically just bystanders and observe the content but don't actively contribute. And I think that rule kind of applies to all sorts of levels of organizations when you're trying to get communication between people. A small percentage do the large portion of the communication work, and a large percentage end up as bystanders. So how to get them into how to kind of nudge them into that zone where they become contributors and content creators, I don't have the answer yet, but it's something to talk about. And maybe sessions like this, maybe frequency. If we did something, I think this is great tonight, what we're doing now. What if you did it, say, once a month, like a town hall session or something, as opposed to having it where there's a 4 or 5 month gap in between sessions? I mean, not a criticism, but just wondering if frequency would help to sort of loosen some of that communication up.
So again, question. I see some nodding heads in the room. Is that something people will be interested in terms of more frequent dialogue sessions? Some nodding heads here. What about on the? We have 3
Hello?
on video. I can see nodding heads or not, or.
Hello, it's Helen McLaughlin speaking from St. Andrews. I think we need a few more technical, adept people before you're going to get very far. There aren't too many people in our groups who are very comfortable with a lot of this stuff. I mean, I can't even use my computer half the time.
So fair comment. And so one of the things we have talked about is a couple of things. This is part of this discussion. The one is just for tonight. Mark went through a lot of work trying to get the satellite site set up. And so for these satellite locations, you kind of need a variety of things, but you need an internet connection. And we can talk about the technical requirements. They're not that huge. Unfortunately, those that are connected by satellite, that can often be problematic because there's a lot of what's called latency. It's because it has to go so far. It's still going at a fast download speed, but it has to go so far, it introduces delays. But the other thing was trying to cross-sect sites that we have that have sufficient bandwidth with where we need them to be with availability of the hall, right? There's a couple of places we've used before that weren't available. So one of the things we've talked about is, do we start thinking about how do we look at getting an internet connection into our churches? How do we help facilitate that? And then beyond that, and actually we've talked about even things like, we could choose to say, and this is something we had at the national discussion we had at the national level. What if you we're all staring at I think a 65-inch TV here, but if we had a simplistic setup that went into every church in the diocese, every church we can connect to, that said, there's a couple of things that can happen. There can be a camera and the screen and a simple setup, like what's called a Raspberry Pi for those that are technical, that you could use to run this stuff, that says you just have to walk in and turn it on and click there. That's what I want to do. We can do that. And the second value to that is that then when you go to project things outwards, you can then those video pieces and some of the folks that don't get email and that, actually it can be playing the latest piece on the video about the Legacy Center in Tamworth, about someone talking in their church about what we're doing here, about the bishop's message, which isn't now just the bishop sending out an email, but it can actually be a minute long video of his ask for, right? And so there's a variety of ways that something like that would loosen it up. I know that technically we've got challenges. You've got to get at internet connections, and you got to make it simple, because a lot of our folks don't play in the technology space. But is that something we should start exploring in a more, talk about it, but is it something we should start doing a feasibility on? Some nodding heads. So the other question would be, if not, why not? Or what should we be focusing at if we start to look at that?
This is Art from St. Andrews. Just saying, I think, Alec, if we had something like that, this is what you need. Some communication as to what we need to upgrade our internet speeds to. And then setting something up. We've got the TV set up in a room at our church, so we're all set for that. It's just the internet speed, I believe, and a few other minor things. Helen just mentioned to me, I think she thinks that, and I agree with her, the more you use it, the more we'll be comfortable with it. And if we don't start to use it, there's a danger that this technology is just going to keep going and going and going, and we'll reach a point where we just can't catch up without a major overhaul or something along those lines, because whether we like it or not, the electronic age is here, and it does provide a wealth of opportunity. And I think we really should be embracing this. But so I think if we start off small, what do we need? What do we have to do to get it? How simple can we make it to operate so that we can have not just a PC guru at each parish, but anybody type of thing can do it if they're following the instructions. I think then it'll be a success. And the more we use it, the more we'll be comfortable, the more we'll want to use it. And then the more we'll be ready for when the technology actually changes and something new comes along, which won't probably be that far away.
And Art, the sort of the focus of this, and I come from a little bit of the background, but it's basically a kiosk, right? Is what you're really talking about, the simplicity. If anybody's been into McDonald's that have put in a kiosk for ordering, oh, I know, it's a good one. But it's a good example. Or when you check in for an airplane and they've got kiosks set up, or you go and you can get information, it's that touch, walk up to it, touch it. What are you trying to do? Push that, right? And then away you go.
Trish Miller from Leeds Anglican Ministries again. The problem that I know we would certainly have is in rural Ontario, you don't have the bandwidth. It depends on how far you are away from the hub. only one of our churches has internet, and when it goes down, and you're handcuffed. Even at home, I had to drive in from Sealy's Bay because my internet is sketchy, my cell phone is sketchy. It's just reality of rural Ontario for now. I hope it changes, but.
Yep, I agree. And what we try and do is then look at the map and say, well, Sealy's Bay may not have the service, but is there, does Lyndhurst or does, and we find ways to build little hubs that it says, well, instead of driving to Kingston, you can drive, right? And, we start to think about, because there are things like Rogers Rocket Hubs. There's a variety of ways we can approach it. And again, I'm game to go back and push these companies to say, give us a break if we do these kinds of things. And I think some of the other dioceses are on the same page of how do you start driving connection. Just watching time. Let me go back just quickly to the there we go. Just any other thoughts around, we've talked about how we communicate. We've talked about ways to potentially increase that. Is the right stuff going out? Is there things that you'd like to see more of? Is there things you'd like to see less of? I think I heard some comments around some places are very active. It's no different than the old days, and still with the dialogue, there are parishes that right up front about getting information in and promoting what they're doing. But is there anything else we should be looking at? We want to get more of or less of? All quiet on the western and eastern front. Okay, well, sure. The bishop can always speak.
It's Bishop Michael here. One thing, a staff meeting last Tuesday, Mark, you mentioned in the e-news, the Anglican 101 section, that you monitor how many clicks happen on that this had a remarkable number of clicks and engagement, which seemed to say to us that when people saw that about an introductory, an opportunity to engage with our particular spirituality, that there was a lot of interest in the traffic that follows e-news as one. The other question I had for you, Mark, is do you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you know how many, I guess I am putting you on the spot, do you know how many, what the subscription is right now in the e-news? I think it'd be interesting for people to hear the numbers of people that are being reached by our weekly newsletter.
Yes, Michael, it's right now it's around 1,040. And it usually hovers around 1,000 plus. I see a little bit of deviation here and there just from email addresses that get changed, and then they bounce, and then they get knocked off the list, and then I see a small number of voluntary subscribers throughout the year, but it's roughly around 1,000 plus.
Alex, if I may jump in, this is Ada Clifton from Wellington, Milford, and Wapoose. Your earlier question about how we can possibly use some of this technology. It would be awesome if Bishop Michael or you or perhaps Wayne once in a while would maybe sit in front of the camera and record a little message for the churches. I often think we get letters to read in our parishes and to post, and how awesome it would be to just have a quick downloadable thing that even if you don't have the internet, if you're using a projector and a computer, just to stick it on your computer and play it for the congregation. I think it would, I know it would be so interesting to watch. So just some thoughts from this end.
That's a good idea, Ada, because it lets you do it in a way that you can download it wherever you've got a connection and then use it later. Yep, I think that's a great idea. Okay, anything else on communications? Last call.
Mark Hauser, St. Mary Magdalene, Napanee. Bishop and Alex, just bringing this up in the forum here, something I mentioned to Alex the other day in speaking is just what if we had something like people could send in questions to the bishop and say once a month you'd pick one question out of the pile. You couldn't do all of them, it would be too much, but respond to say pull one question out of that hat and do a video response for it. Then we could post on the once a month on e-news. And the questions could be anything, or maybe 1 month you want to drive it down a certain path. Anyway, just something to think about for future along those kind of lines.
The bishop just pointed out that we do have a fireplace in our new room here, so that we could have fireside chats.
Bishop, I know, I'd love to see that.
By the way, it's a great, and that's another one that, by the way, I think several of you have noted, but there is, if you look at your control panel, there is the ability to have chat. And so I just threw up for everybody to see, I think, but you can see that you can have the same way that there's conversations where, John can turn to Anne and say, well, that was a brilliant point. You can also, this can go on within this tool. You can chat back and forth, and you can chat out. So you don't have to say, that was awesome, but you do by putting it in text. So that tool is there. It allows for either for you to send it one-to-one, to say, I'm just sending it to Mark going, what was that about? Or I can send it out to everybody. And so there is a chat. Part of this tool is there's a chat capability. Sorry, we had another.
Georgina Stewart. I'm currently a sponsored student in the diocese, and as such, I've been looking at all the parishes, trying to get to know them in preparation for doing placements, and I'm surprised at how many don't have a web presence. And I realize that a lot are small, a lot don't have easy internet access, etc. But I wonder if that's something that the diocese could help out with.
And again, that's something that I would say yes. I also know there's a little bit of history to that, where there has been work where the diocese has had email and offered that web hosting. And Mark, does anybody still use it?
I'm sorry, Alex?
The parish webpage hosting ability, does anybody still use I mean, I know lots of numbers do, but do parishes still use the off the core the way you had?
I think there's one or two.
And again, that's something
whether it's active or not, I'm not even sure.
That's something we can do. We're building a new technology infrastructure. That's something we can do in terms of offering. We can offer some pretty sophisticated web capabilities with Microsoft Azure and some other things that we now have access to very realistically. So that's something that if parishes, but I would say again, if parishes want it, please come talk to us, because we'll be looking for some pilots, but also something that we're happy to try and help with, because both getting the technology and then getting it implemented.